Hello there and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, to this special coverage from Ukraine file. European Union considers further sanctions on Russia, including banning coal imports, and Moscow wants to keep ties with the West open. On the other side, Kiev announces fresh attempt to evacuate citizens from a siege city of Mariupol. And the whole world now is trying to condemn Russia over Bucha massacres, including Pope Francis. Today's updates pushed us to ask several questions. Will Russia end this conflict after the discovery of these corpses in Bucha? And can diplomacy resolve this conflict? Multiple questions are directed to our panel of guests. We have Mr. Valentin Yakushki, an international relations professor, and Mr. Claudio Kilani, editor of Strategic Alert Service from Germany. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us in this debate. The show begins right after this break. And before we delve into discussion, let me invite you to follow this report. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addresses the United Nations on Tuesday to remove Russia from the Security Council days after Ukraine provided evidence of killings and atrocities alleged committed by the Russian troops. Let's follow this report.
In a video addressed to the United Nations on Tuesday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called to remove Russia from its place as a permanent member of the Security Council, where it holds veto power, arguing that it was time to reform the global peacekeeping body.
If you don't know how to make this decision, there are two things you can do. Either exclude Russia as an aggressor and initiator of the war so that it does not block decisions relating to its own aggression, then do everything possible to establish peace.
The Ukrainian president's speech was accompanied by harrowing images showing some of the massacres discovered in Ukrainian cities that were under Russian occupation. However, Russia insisted the images were staged.
I would simply like to take advantage of the virtual presence here of the President of Ukraine and address him directly. We now submit your conscience the groundless accusations against the Russian military, which are not confirmed by any eyewitnesses.
The United States agreed with Zelensky and called as well for Russia's suspension from the Human Rights Council.
Given the growing mountain of evidence, Russia should not have a position of authority in a body whose very purpose is to promote respect for human rights.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned of global fallout from the conflict in Ukraine.
Our analysis indicates that 74 developing countries with a total population of 1.2 billion people are particularly vulnerable to spiking food, energy and fertilizer costs.
There is no provision or mechanism to remove a permanent member of the Security Council written into the UN Charter. The 5 permanent members are Russia, the US, United Kingdom, France and China. Each permanent member holds a veto power to reject measures brought up for a vote on the Security Council.
Mr. Valentin, since you are in Ukraine, I will start with you. Based on this report, and since you are an analyst and professor in the field of international relations, let me highlight some words Ukraine's president said. Tell me your explanation about it. Tyranny would have ceased to exist and peace would have prevailed. Do you think that UN Security Council could put an end to this conflict in Ukraine?
What President of Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky, proposed, it's a very efficient political step, propagandistic step, and ideological step. But realistically, looking at this, it may be possible to implement such ideas only in case if the United States and the West, of which the United States are the leader, agrees that it's time to make the world being split into two warring groups of nations. One, the West, and those who follow the West, and the second, those whom the West will consider to be outcasts. So like it was 105 years ago, when one nation appeared to be just fighting against all other world, like when there was revolution in Russia. Then the West just was united against Russia, but that was totally different Russia, with special ideology, with a message to all nations who are fighting for justice, to working people. This Russia, which is now, it is not an ideological, not a economic conceptual opponent of the West. It's just a bad version of the West. Russia is mirroring the Western experiences in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, but mirroring them, these experiences, in a very clumsy way, in the worst possible way, when it attacks Ukraine, the brotherly, ethnically, spiritually nation of Russia. The West was never doing that. Even when there was destruction of Ireland many hundreds years ago, there was difference in the languages. Here, between the warring factions, here there is nothing. Spiritually, ethnically, they are similarly. This is fratricidal war. Russia made an awful mistake to over-assess its own forces to make a quick change of regime and occupy Ukraine. Now it's a fighting between two countries, and in which one country is represented by all its nation. Ukrainians are fighting as heroes. So what about the West? The West is not ready to accept this proposal to split the world into two warring factions. It will continue existence, this present United Nations system, with further sanctions against Russia, with further weakening of Russia, of its role in the world, and its tragedy for ordinary Russian people.
Thank you, Mr.
It is a trap for Russia.
Mr. Claudiu, do you think that UN Security Council will give the right to Ukraine over Russia's claims that Bucha massacre is staged by Ukraine soldiers and Ukraine media?
Well, the UN Security Council is not working because some members of it wanted to destroy, and we saw it yesterday when they decided not to launch an independent investigation on what happened in Bucha and maybe other places, but they simply mandated the EU and the Ukrainian government to do it. So the United Nations Security Council is abdicating to its role, and it's ridiculous. It's you cannot have a judgment, and you cannot have a political action based on anything else than a forensic investigation of what happened in Bucha. And if you have an EU commission, an EU team doing this is ridiculous. The EU is part of the conflict, it's not independent. The EU and NATO are deciding to send now more weapons to one of the parts in the Ukrainian war. So they are part of the war. It's unheard of that you can call this an independent investigation. So anybody who takes a political action on the basis of video material provided to public opinion by one of the warring party is for me a clown.
All right. Moving on, in a new video, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky criticized the UN, saying that it is unable to perform the functions for which it was created. Let's listen it.
After what the world saw in Bucha, sanctions against Russia must be commensurate with the gravity of the occupiers' war crimes. Today, Kiev is the capital of world democracy, the capital of the struggle for freedom on the European continent. The UN is currently unable to perform the functions for which it was created.
Mr. Valentin, coming back to you, instead of asking help, Ukraine's president is criticizing the UN security, saying that the United Nations system must be reformed immediately. How can you explain his rage over the UN, although all the world is trying to help Ukraine in comparison to other countries? Why does he keep criticizing everyone?
In my assessment, President of Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky, is right that the institutions of the United Nations are unable to prevent such conflict, such war as the war in Ukraine, as the Russian attack on Ukraine. It was unable to prevent other wars in Iraq, in Yugoslavia, in Libya. Why? Because what is important, it's now, this is the correlation of forces between the major powers, the United States, China, Russia, Britain, and some other countries. So now the real mechanism is the relations between the United States, Russia, and China. If they cannot reach any agreement, if they cannot try to save Ukrainian nation from total destruction, then the war will continue like it was in Libya, in Iraq, like it is in Syria. It is necessary to have comprehension between the leadership of the United States and Russia. And this understanding cannot be reached now. And we Ukrainians, we are doomed to sufferings. We have to concentrate on rebuffing the attacks and on finding a fair solution. It's difficult, but it's the situation now. It's necessary that the world community pressurizes on Russian leadership, on the United States leadership, that they find the way how to let Ukraine to survive. And now, when we cannot reach yet the peaceful agreement, we need to concentrate on some interim measures, like avoiding looting. There are mass lootings of Ukrainian citizens' properties in the cities, towns, and villages occupied by Russian army. Russian army is unable to have orderly actions of its own soldiers and officers. This is the key issue, and I think it can be resolved by pressing on the Russian leadership. Another, how to preserve potential for production of agricultural products and of industrial products. If there is war, there are possibilities to avoid fighting in the factories and avoid destroying the depots.
Perfectly understood, Mr. Valentin. Mr. Claudiu, Mr. Valentin is saying that United Nations and President Zelensky, he's right to criticize United Nations Security Council because they are not really performing something good for Ukraine. But same time, and same thing happened in Libya, Iraq, but no one dares to criticize Ukraine. Why these double standards?
Because the Western media are controlled by the warring party. They are controlled by the interests which are part of the war in Ukraine. And with this, I mean the major media which are controlled by financial interests, which are seated in the city of London and in Wall Street. I mean, look what they did yesterday at the UN Security Council. I mean, there are members of the UN Security Council who are not able to fix the situation because they want an escalation. They want continuation of the war. Yesterday evening, the spokesman of the White House, Mrs. Psaki, said that they are starting new sanctions and they already issued some of them. And their aim is to provoke a default of Russia. She used the word default. She said, we will put Russia in before the choice is that you default or you will bleed to death by using the rest of your reserves, the one which we have not frozen. Now, yesterday they froze. They had already seized over $350 billion, which the Russian central bank had in dollar-denominated assets. But they had allowed so far the Russian government to pay Western bondholders at deadline with that money, taking it from that money. Now, yesterday they decided they freeze this also. They freeze this as well. So I think Mr. Zelensky is right when he says that UN Security Council is not able to prevent the war and to reach a peaceful solution.
Perfectly
By the way, it's the
understood.
same
I
thing.
beg your pardon, Mr. Claudio, but don't you think what is happening now is kind of a leftover of the Second World War, especially when Russia keeps saying that Ukraine's Nazism should be stopped?
In a sense, yes, because you have one aspect which is this Nazi element, which is really outstanding, and I could quote from videos in Russian which have been taken in Mariupol, which contradict what our friend from Ukraine just said, where inhabitants of Mariupol described the behavior of the so-called Azov battalion and the other Nazi troops there who are shooting against Ukrainian citizens. Now, I don't want to do this because, as I said at the beginning, we have war propaganda on both sides, and to find the truth, we need independent investigations. But back to your question, a continuation of Second World War, you have to take in account the fact that these Nazi leftover in Ukraine, who are a minority, are a minority, but they control power because they have weapons, and they have been supported and financed by Western powers. Number one, Great Britain. So now you have a paradox, Great Britain coming out as winner in the war against fascism, financing Nazis in Ukraine. But it's only an apparent paradox. If you know the history of World War II, you know that Great Britain flirted with fascism and Nazis until these the two countries, Germany and Italy, turned against France and Great Britain, because the idea was to have Germany going against Russia in the first place, because this is Britain's geopolitical game, to have European nations fighting each other. That's what's going now.
Clear enough. All right. Let me share with you, gentlemen, this piece of information. The head of the Russian diplomacy, Sergei Lavrov, considers that discovery of corpses in the Ukraine city of Bucha is provocation aimed at derailing the ongoing negotiations between Kiev and Moscow. Let's listen.
The question arises, what is the reason for this open and false provocation, the veracity of which is simply impossible to establish? We are led to believe that it serves to find a pretext to torpedo the negotiations. 3 days after the departure of our soldiers from the town of Bucha, a provocation was organized there. The one we are talking about today, we have every reason to believe that this one was done with the aim of diverting attention of the negotiations process.
Mr. Claudio, in Germany precisely and in Europe generally, do you think and do you believe that this conflict will come to an end with peace negotiations? And what are you saying about Lavrov, who is saying that Bucha massacres are provocation to escalate the tension more and more?
Well, if we don't have yet an independent investigation and we consider propaganda on both sides, then we have to ask ourselves the famous question, cui prodest in Latin, which means who is benefiting from this. And then you find out, last time I told you that I was skeptical about this peace negotiation in Turkey. But you have this, coincidence that each time there is a progress in these negotiations, then you have an escalation, an incident which provokes an escalation on the other side. So the answer to this question, who benefits, is certainly the interests, the forces that want an escalation, who are staging this, if this is a staged incident. But I repeat, we need some independent forensic expert who goes there and can establish when the people were killed and how were they killed. And until we don't have this from an independent investigation and transparent, documented thing, we cannot draw a consequential political action from this.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Valentin, some newspapers and critics declared that the ongoing conflict in Ukraine is making business to others, especially in the West and precisely the US. Officials over there could end up this conflict before starting this war, and the aim is to weaken Russia and expose its capabilities. So they know what they are dealing with. What are you saying about this?
Well, the war, which we see now, it's multi-level and multi-aspect. Definitely one of the aims is to make Russia very weak, not to be a competitor of the West. It's openly was said by the President of the United States some 2 weeks ago, or a little bit more, and now by his press secretary, it's open. But it's not the major issue there. This war is also the war of Ukrainian patriotism. It's the war of creating a real Ukrainian nation. Nobody has the right to attack a sovereign nation. And if we look at your previous question concerning the massacre of civilians, I see the cause, the roots of it in the direct attack on Ukrainian cities and towns where civilian population was, and indiscriminate fighting there in Bucha and in surrounding towns. My relatives lived there for 15 days. They were hiding under one of the houses there, and they saw and they explained to me by telephone what was happening. Hundreds and thousands of people were killed there because of shooting, of bombing there, and because Russian soldiers were not prepared for such kind of activities. It was not like American soldiers who were doing similar thing in the cities and towns in Iraq, where at some stage they tried to avoid civilian casualties. There it was not the case. It was total destruction of these towns near Bucha. Mm-hmm. And what else? Russians were not soldiers, were not morally trained to avoid killings. They killed somebody who was moving in a car because somebody was considered to be the attacker. My relatives saw this. It is awful situation. The world must resolve this issue in practical terms. How to avoid fighting within the cities where there are civilians. Civilians must be saved.
Valentin. Russian President Vladimir Putin proposed on Tuesday to monitor food deliveries to hostile countries in the Kremlin amid a wave of sanctions against Moscow that have consequences for many agricultural sectors. He also ordered to strengthen the production of agricultural equipment in Russia and assure that national food production fully covered the country's needs, while highlighting Russia's agricultural potential.
The situation in the energy sector is worsening as a result of non-market, brute measures, including administrative pressure on our company Gazprom in some European countries. We are already hearing statements from official figures about the nationalization of some of our assets. We can go far like that. Let no one forget that this is a double-edged sword. It is clear that this year In a context of global food shortages, we will have to be more cautious in our food deliveries abroad, and in particular monitor the conditions of these exports to countries that are pursuing a hostile policy against us. Here we need to establish clear guidelines for import substitution and keep them clear in the very near future, given the potential of the national agro-industrial complex, our science and our industry. We have every opportunity to do so.
Mr. Claudio, based on the truth we all know, Russia is a very rich country in all fields, energy, agriculture, etc. Do you think that sanctions of the whole world will stop Putin's plans if he wants to keep going all along till the end?
No, sanctions will not stop Russia. Russia can be largely self-sufficient because it has a lot of raw material and it has a lot of food production capabilities. They can hurt Russia minimally. Russia could suffer a slump in the GDP in general production, but Russia is already reconverting its trade relationships towards Asian countries, towards China, towards India, etc. Sanctions will hurt badly Europe, and especially on the price inflation, consumer price inflation, food price inflation. And this is one of the reasons why not only Europe, but also developing countries, Northern Africa in the first place, there is already a situation of pre-riots in Africa and in Latin America. So that's the reason why we must reach a negotiated peace as soon as possible. And why now these escalations, these knee-jerk reactions to some videos coming from one of the warring parties? This reaction with an escalation on the side of NATO and Europe is damaging the peace process. But let me, in a few seconds, answer to our Ukrainian friends where he says that Ukraine needs to develop as a nation, and we need and it must be based on a patriotic idea. Well, yes, I agree with you, but patriotism can never be affirmed and built against something, against another nation, against another population or part of its population. And that's unfortunately what we have seen in Ukraine since the coup in 1214 with the discrimination of the so-called Russian ethnic population. We have produced an action plan, which you can find. It was commissioned, my agency was commissioned by the Schiller Institute. You can find it on the webpage.
Okay, Mr. Claudio. Okay.
Action plan for a development program, which must be part of the peace negotiations.
Thank you, Mr. Claudio. Mr. Valentin, what do you have as an answer in 2 minutes left for us to end the show? He's saying that Ukraine, if Ukraine wants its independence, they wouldn't practice harsh consequences and acts over people in Lugansk and Luhansk.
Well, Russian leadership has done everything in order that Ukraine is being formed as a country and as a nation totally separate from Russia. Whatever Russian leadership proclaimed, everything is on the reverse. Ukraine is more united now. It is becoming more nationalistic. Most of Ukrainians dislike Russians, and there is hatred, which is very harmful to hate somebody, but it's the result of an attack, of an aggression. And as to Russia, Russia with the sanctions will be becoming less oligarchic and becoming more right-wing populistic. At some stage, it may become left-wing populistic state. So a very serious process of changes has started for Russia. There will be definitely regime change and change of the type of the society.
Thank you, Mr.
Russia
Valentin.
is experiencing the way of Iran now, or of North Korea, to be isolated state. And the same big changes, will be in Ukraine. We do not know what will regime there, but there will be reconstructionist tough regime in order to give back to the people of Ukraine possibility to live in peace and in fair conditions.
I beg your pardon to stop you over here, Mr. Valentin. Thank you so much. Mr. Claudio, thank you so much also for always in your presence with us. Ladies and gentlemen, to this end, we reached an end to our TV show. See you for tomorrow, another special coverage. Bye-bye.